Okay, good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to you all. My name is Helmut Aust, and I'm addressing you in two capacities tonight, as a professor of public and international law at Freie Universität Berlin, but also as director at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public and International Law in Heidelberg. And this is actually the first time that I say these words in a public setting. I'm also extending these words of welcome on behalf of Christoph Bernhardt, my dear colleague of Humboldt University Berlin, with whom I had the pleasure to conceptualize this event. At Freie Universität, this event is supported by our Institute of Public International and European Union Law, as well as our Empirical Legal Studies Center. And with regard to the Max Planck Institute, I would like to express my gratitude to the Berlin office, Alexandra Kämmerer and Chiara Rimkus, who have invested a lot of hard work in making this event possible. And finally, and this is the last institutional point, this event is also taking place in the context of the International Law Association's Committee on Urbanisation and International Law Potential and Pitfalls, which Janne Neyman and I are co-chairing alongside our co-rapporteurs Anel Duplessis and Mirko Sorsai. Now, we have gathered here to reflect on the relationship between cities and climate change. Cities are drivers of climate change. They generate a wide variety of emissions. Just consider the built environment, traffic, industrial production, also the digital economy, which depends on server farms located in rural areas. All these activities in which we are part contribute to the global climate crisis and exacerbate its effects. Climate change law requires not only mitigation of emissions, but also adaptation to climate change. And here, cities can be particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Think of urban heat waves or urban water scarcity. And furthermore, cities can be sites where issues of loss and damage are particularly imminent. At the same time, cities can also be a part of the solution to many of the problems relating to climate change. They can participate in mitigation efforts and potentially step in where national governments are unwilling or unable to do enough. They can develop and implement adaptation measures tailored to local conditions. They can foster citizen engagement, thereby helping to stabilize political processes in the face of climate fatigue and outright denial of climate change. When nation states abandon the fight against climate change, as it has happened again with the Trump administration, the role of cities can become even more important. Now, these aspects provide us with ample reason for an interdisciplinary conversation on these matters. However, there's an additional factor that makes this panel timely. As many of you will know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is currently preparing a special report on cities and climate change as part of its 7th assessment cycle. Just 3 days ago, the second order draft was made available for expert review. As our distinguished guest and IPCC lead author, Matthias Garschagen, will explain later, the process in this context does not allow us to collectively assess now specific formulations and passages of the forthcoming special report. Nonetheless, I do think that we come here together with a special sense of purpose and urgency regarding both the underlying issue of climate change, but also the forthcoming IPCC report. This report will be, I am sure, a further milestone in what can be called the globalization of urban governance. This notion refers to a process whereby urban and local governance is no longer just a local or national matter. Today, cities around the world are not only connected to global developments factually and their impact on their local territories, they are also exposed to an increasing number of normative expectations derived from various global sources of law and other forms of political norms. What is more, cities are not just passive recipients of global and international norms coming proverbially from above with a view to implementation at the local level. The practice of cities is not limited to national contexts. It is precisely in the field of climate change governance where cities have emerged as internationally relevant actors, in particular through the creation of city networks, which connect cities from different states with a view to entrenching climate change action at the local level, exchange best practices, shape standards for urban climate change projects, and impact on the overall development of the global climate change regime. Let me give you two examples of particularly relevant city networks in this area. ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, is a network comprising over 2,500 cities and other subnational entities. The acronym originally stood for International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, which gives away the fact that this network was first created in the context of the Rio Conference and its mission to develop so-called local Agenda 21s. As the charter of ICLEI states in Article 1.3, ICLEI's mission is to build and serve a worldwide movement of local governments to achieve tangible improvements in global sustainability, with a special focus on environmental conditions through cumulative local actions. While ICLEI is open to any committed local government, other city networks are more selective about their membership. The primary example of this type of network is C40, originally set up as C20 in 2005, based on an idea by the then mayor of London, Ken Livingstone. The original idea was to mimic the G20 format from the interstate world and bring together the city actors that truly matter in the sphere of climate change governance. Initially understood to be a network of megacities, this network was later complemented also with smaller cities, so-called innovator cities, and it has successfully established itself as a particularly important actor in the field of climate change. Today, C40 includes 96 member cities. Germany has 2 member cities, and somewhat fittingly for tonight's event, they are Berlin and Heidelberg. The C40 now describes itself as bringing together leading cities that demonstrate exceptional climate leadership at a global level. There may be an element of self-promotion in maintaining membership of this type of network, but the underlying idea is that cities can accelerate climate change action. For a variety of reasons, ICLEI, C40, but also other city networks were able to establish themselves as internationally relevant actors. For one, they developed a particularly strong profile during the first 2 decades of the 21st century, at a time when the intergovernmental system of climate change governance appeared to be mired in apathy. States talk, cities act became the mantra of global city networks who sought to establish a role for themselves in global governance processes. Simultaneously, the normative environment of city action at the international level developed favorably. 2015 saw the adoption of the Paris Agreement, which contains a careful acknowledgement of the role played by cities and local governments in the climate change regime. Additionally, the UN General Assembly adopted the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, and the inclusion of SDG 11 as a separate standalone goal on cities and local communities highlights the importance that the international level nowadays attributes to the local level. In this context, the future IPCC special report on climate change in cities is particularly important in supporting the development of cities as key players in the global climate change regime. In its 2025 advisory opinion on the obligations of states in respect of climate change, the International Court of Justice emphasized that in terms of its interpretation of the scientific evidence, it will rely, and I quote, primarily on the IPCC reports, which participants agree constitute the best available science on the causes, nature, and consequences of climate change, end of quote. For natural scientists, this may be self-evident. However, for the purposes of international law, this is an important statement, particularly given the consensus identified by the court among participants, a term which in this context refers both to states which appeared before the court, but also to international organizations. This raises intriguing follow-up questions regarding the impact of IPCC work on international lawmaking. The IPCC describes itself as an organization of governments on its website. As it was established as a cooperative body between two UN institutions, the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Programme, it is not an international organization based on a founding treaty. Rather, it has been described as a soft international organization, and with this status, its work lies outside the categories of formal international lawmaking, as Renato Sterla and Mats Andenas observe. However, they write, its values, goals, regulatory activities, and policy assessments, while not binding, nonetheless reflect what states or groups of states accept and prioritize in the international community. In this context, the finding of the upcoming special report on climate change in cities could further consolidate the emerging role of cities and their networks in international law, although this is certainly not the primary objective of the special report process. Now, would this be a welcome development? Some in the international law literature have cautioned against relying too straightforwardly on the work of the IPCC. These voices do not come from climate skeptics, but rather from those concerned about the epistemology of international law and the processes through which legality is constructed. Fleur Johns has criticized some time ago that international law scholarship would only superficially engage with the work of the IPCC. To the extent that it does, she writes, there would have been three typical moves to receive IPCC reports as supra-legal precipitants of legal action, as supra-legal sources of evidence of unusually compelling status, or as expressions of some supra-legal consensual community. Now, these concerns underlying John's rich analysis, of which I can only give the briefest of all conceivable snapshots here, are that it can appear misleadingly easy to translate the global scientific consensus into the law. It is at this point that an interdisciplinary conversation is needed, and this has been the core idea behind this event. The current IPCC process is particularly well set up to take on board some of the critical signposts identified by Fleur Johns, reflecting on how to connect scientific evidence with legal normativity. Johns pointed towards the influential work of Harriet Bulkeley, whose work has significantly shaped our understanding of multi-level governance in the field of climate change, including the role of cities and other subnational actors, and who is now a lead author of the forthcoming report. Tonight's event is intended to contribute to this interdisciplinary process by bringing together different voices from law, geography, geoecology, and history. We aim to capture a multitude of relevant perspectives. In particular, we will address a number of questions inspired by the various disciplinary backgrounds of our distinguished panelists. These questions include: how is the current global urban condition determined by a hyper-capitalist system of financialization, which may further entrench colonial continuities and undermine climate justice and equity? How can cities be planned and built differently today, and where are cutting-edge practices being developed that could help cities contribute to the mitigation and adaptation of climate change? How can the goals of the climate change regime be translated into administrative law categories, which can be quite removed from global climate change law discourses? And finally, what insights can we gain from a broader historical perspective on climate change processes and their unfolding in urban contexts, not least in the light of current discussions on the role of cities in bringing about the Anthropocene? Christoph Bernhardt and I are very grateful that a group of wonderful scholars has agreed to discuss these issues with us tonight. So a heartfelt thank you already now in advance to Priya Gupta, Anne Holsten and Angela Schwertfeger for accepting our invitation. I will leave it to Alexandra Kämmerer later on to introduce the panelists when we move to the panel discussion. For now, however, I would like to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Professor Matthias Garschagen, who is since April 2026 Professor of Development of Urban and Rural Areas at the Rheinische Friedrich-Wilhelms-Universität Bonn. And before that, he held a chair at Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität München. Professor Garschagen is a lead author of the IPCC, and in this capacity is also involved in the current process towards the special report on climate change and cities. His research focuses on risk, vulnerability, adaptation, and transformation in the context of environmental hazards and climate change, particularly in cities. Another focus is on the evaluation of different adaptation options and the governance of risk reduction, particularly at the interface of state and non-state actors. So there's definitely a connection to the theme of this evening. Professor Garschagen, we are extremely grateful that you have come to Berlin tonight for this event, and we are looking forward now to listening to your impulse presentation, which will set us up for the following interdisciplinary conversation on the panel to follow. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Good, thank you. All right, yeah. Thanks so much for the kind introduction and for the invitation in the first place. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a very great pleasure actually to meet many new colleagues and hopefully to also kickstart new joint thinking, joint collaboration. I was asked to talk a little bit about the special report on cities, and then when we discussed what I can do and what I cannot do, we realized, well, wait a minute, I can actually not formally speak so much about the content. You might have the content because you might be reviewing it. I'll get to that in a second. But I think from what Professor Aust said, just in the introductory words, it became quite clear also it's important to understand the process also of how such an IPCC report is actually being established, and maybe also what's increasingly being a very politicized process, how normative and analytical domains come together and so forth, all of that stuff. So I'll talk in the first part of my talk a little bit about the IPCC as a process, and then I'll do a certain trick. Then I'll talk about other research and previous IPCC assessment reports to think a little bit about where do we stand in terms of urban risk and urban adaptation. And there I might give you a couple of hints whether certain findings have been confirmed in the current assessment or not. Let's see. Okay, so the IPCC, I mean, it has become quite clear what the IPCC is when it has been established in the late 80s, and basically with a mandate to provide to policymakers the best available science to do policy and governance of this emerging problem. Quite a fantastic understanding, actually, really a joint global understanding. We have a global problem here. The atmosphere doesn't give much about borders, and we need the best available science because it's a very young scientific field. In the meantime, it has turned a little bit about, it has become a very active field, and we need to understand where does science agree, where's the uncertainties in science and so forth. How wonderful, actually, and how other fields have actually followed. Think about the health domain mainly, and how, you know, the pandemic actually was a boost to such developments. Quite an interesting thing in itself. Typically, the IPCC is actually organized in so-called assessment cycles. I give you here a snapshot of the last assessment cycle. Cycles you see on the bottom, the main assessment reports and the three working groups. The first one on the physical science base of climate, the second one on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, that's where I belong to, and the third one on mitigation and what can be done about mitigating climate change. And then sometimes governments, which are sort of mandating the entire process, are asking for more, asking for special reports for things of special interest. And here it comes. In the last assessment cycle already, cities were of special interest, but there were three things which governments voted were of more interest. What happens after 1.5 degrees, what happens to climate change and land, and what happens actually to the ocean and the cryosphere. So to a certain extent, the cities report is sort of a leftover from the last assessment cycle, and that's the only special report now in this assessment cycle. And then usually there have been synthesis reports wrapping everything up in the end. What is quite interesting, it's really a co-production process, as we say, where really the scientists hold the pen. So the science is really very influential, and there's only stuff in the report which scientists have agreed on, but there is a co-reviewing and approval process which goes through many iterative cycles. I will not go step by step, but it's basically a government-driven process in the sense that they mandate a report, then authors come together, scope the contents and potential outline of a report that will then be approved by governments again. Then a bureau is set up to select authors based on capacities they need. And then there is in most reports, 3 different drafts: zero, an internal draft, then a first order draft, a second order draft, and a final government draft. Each of those go through review. And you would see in a minute that for the special report on cities, the second order draft is just out for review by experts, and this time around also by governments. And there will be review comments coming in to all of these drafts. And then in the end, you see there on the bottom right, the approval and acceptance of the report. So the quality or the underlying summary for policymakers is then being approved in an approval session where together with representatives of over, sometimes over 180, 190 of the participating governments in the IPCC come together and approve word by word this summary for policymakers. Now, is that a bad thing or a good thing? People have been arguing that's watering down the science. You could also argue, well, at the end of the day, this being a consensus-driven process, all of the IPCC reports, which have very clear language and very clear scientific findings in them, and warnings and so forth, are non-disputed by any of the governments on this planet. Certainly those participating in the IPCC, but there's only 1 or 2 which don't participate. That might be an increasing issue now, but let's see. So this gives you here a snapshot. That was one of the approval sessions, the earlier ones in the last assessment cycle, the special report on oceans and the cryosphere. But similar things happen then after each of the working group reports. We can surely debate what that process is, but I think it's quite interesting to understand that process. So what do governments need in terms of knowledge? Is it understandable for them? And how do we go about assessing it? And when we assess in the IPCC, there is a sort of a calibrated language. You might have seen these confidence statements. How certain are we about certain findings? We go through, we check for statistics, models, observations, experiments, and so forth. Is there enough evidence to actually come to agreement or come to a conclusion, yes or no? If there is agreement or if there is enough evidence, then you go about evaluating how confident you are about the observations you are making, about the models that you have in the literature, and so forth. And then you have these confidence language statements, but always a mixture of evidence and agreement. Do you have high evidence in the literature? Do you have high agreement in the literature or not? And if you can even go further, more for the statistical analysis of, for instance, certain climate tipping points or so, then can you have statistical likelihood statements to it. So this is what you always see in the italics in these things, and that's becoming very policy relevant, of course. How certain can we be about certain trends, about whether certain options for mitigating climate change work or not, all of these questions. A quite nice snapshot from the SROC report here. How does that work then in total? We had in the SROC report 104 authors. IPCC, like global science in total, has a gender issue here, but is improving quite heavily. There were quite many authors from different countries involved, and we thought back then that 30,000 comments for one full report across the different phases of review were a lot. This has gone up through the roof. In the first order draft of the cities report, we had chapters. Chapter 1 received over 10,000 comments just on the first order draft, just chapter 1. The chapter I'm co-leading, chapter number 3, received over 6,000 review comments, and we have to respond review comment by review comment that goes up online and can be checked by those who comment on it. So think twice before you comment, but think properly. But it's actually a heck of a lot of work and very diligent work behind it. That's what I'm trying to see. Hopefully many of you, also the young upcoming researchers in the room, might be thinking about whether or not to sort of put their hat in the ring for an IPCC assessment, to be nominated by their governments. It's a lot of work. You need to have an institution behind you which evaluates and values that. That's also true because the literature is going through the roof. You have a picture here which is showing you on the left-hand side basically how many studies we have to crunch in the assessment cycles. The different assessment cycles here, assessment report number 1, and then all the way to the 6th assessment report number 6. And you see roughly here, that's just an ISI Web of Science assessment, basically, which are the studies related to climate change. And you see in the last assessment cycle, we had in the neighborhood of 400,000 studies to crunch. In the moment, that's even going higher up. We're maybe in the neighborhood of 80 to 90,000 studies per year. And for those who are very quick in math, that's roughly coming down currently to 250 papers being published per day on the issue of climate change. And by mandate, we can discuss that later, by mandate basically, the assessment task is to assess that literature and to synthesize that literature into the best available science. What can AI and so forth do? You can see here that in latest IPCC reports, we've only actually managed to cite a fraction and a declining fraction of that literature. So that's a quite large challenge, of course. So that gives you a little bit of an overview of how the IPCC works as an assessment process. So bottom line, a very thorough assessment process mandated by governments. Governments want to know something about the climate change. They want to know where the science stands. We want to provide the best available science, and there's certain logics on how to do that in a co-production process. That opens up, I think, many, many points we can discuss on the panel, whether that's a good process or not a good process, whether it's actually still workable in the future, how do you do that with this amount of literature, and all sorts of questions. But I'll keep that to the podium discussion or to your questions. I provide you later in the last slide the link and a QR code where you can sign up to become an expert reviewer for the current second order draft. Okay, but I do it in the last slide so you don't start drafting your review responses right now. Because I still have a second block I would like to share with you. I was asked to talk a little bit about global climate risk. Why do we do, from a city's perspective, the engagement with climate change? It's not only because cities are the main contributor to the problem, or one of the main contributors, depending on how you count, whether you count urban consumption or not. If you count urban consumption, it's by far the largest contributor, of course. If you count just the emissions in cities and so forth, there's different scope emissions, we can discuss that later. Cities play a huge role. But it's also interesting because cities are, of course, the regions on Earth where most people live, where most of the economies are, where most of the values and infrastructure are, and the economy and economic activities are. And they are quite vulnerable and quite exposed to these threats. So let's see a little bit where do we stand. In understanding the risks, first questions, where do we stand then? And I think that will not be too new to many of you, but maybe I'll create a couple of aha moments also here. A couple of things also from a legal perspective we need to think about, which we haven't thought so deeply about. Secondly, where do we stand then in dealing with that problem? Where do we stand in climate change adaptation? Everybody discusses climate change adaptation. What is actually really being done? And can, for instance, public law play a role in accelerating that? I'll come to that. Third question, what can we learn from local case studies? And I'll provide one or two local case studies, time allowing, but mostly from a couple of parts of the world only. So trends in extreme events, a couple of slides here, which we have generated for the last assessment cycle. That's a picture here out of the summary for policymakers of the first working group report. Heavy precipitation events go up in intensity and in frequency, quite heavily so. You can see that here, quite a powerful, also for school education and simple policymaker education, quite a powerful picture here, where you can see, where are we currently out of 10 events? Have we already gotten up to 2 in 10 events? Will it go up to 3 in 10 events in terms of the 10-year extreme event that we have seen? And are they becoming more extreme? Because, all of that stuff. Warmer air can hold more water and so forth, more heavy precipitation. The same goes for heat temperature. And this is not even counting for urban heat island effects. So for heat, actually, picture is much more extreme. We really have a heat problem in cities globally. You know that we had very powerful messages in the last reports. I think that's all known to everybody. We talked a little bit about coastal cities before starting this panel here, and that's maybe a slide which is not so well known to people. And it hinges, or it really illustrates how speedy some of that change is going to happen and what challenge we have also in accelerating adaptation. There's still that sort of notion we really have to get acting on climate mitigation, that we're running out of time for climate change mitigation. We're hitting 1.5 degrees, we're on track to 2 degrees and so forth, and all of that is true. But too often in policymaker circles, the assumption goes, for adaptation we still have a bit more time because all of that impacts and so forth, all of that needs to unfold. I challenge that here a little bit. That's a picture or a map we drew in the a special report on oceans and the cryosphere, and we had a very similar map also then in the synthesis report. What it shows basically in a roughly 4-degree world or a high emissions world, RCP 8.5, vis-a-vis a more Paris-aligned world here, you see a lot of coastal gorging stations. And you see, for instance, also the data paucity that we have in Africa. Just to say, it's not that Africa doesn't have a challenge there, but it doesn't have too many data points. But what you can see is basically, for my field of work, urban geography, spatial planning, and so forth, in Germany, we have legally a very important threshold, which is a 1 in a 100-year flood event. That actually dictates in Germany where you can build, where you cannot build, what you can do, what you have to invest in terms of public spending on coastal protection and so forth. We ask here the question, when does that event, which is basically the result of a social contract in the society to say this is our risk sort of equation, we protect up until there, the rest is too expensive for us, we will not do that, we will accept the other odd event. When does that event become an annual event? And you see on the timeline there, the darker the point, the sooner that fundamental shift will have happened. And you see, shockingly, even if we mitigate, this will happen very soon. In many parts of the world, for many coastal cities, what used to be a 1 in a 100-year flood event, extreme event, will become an annual event, statistically speaking, in maybe 20 years from now. Now, think about a city like Singapore, think about a city like New York, Rotterdam, Hamburg, and so forth, to completely revamp coastal protection and how long it takes to do that. From a legal planning perspective, public participation perspective, you might need to change legislation, spatial planning legislation, and so forth. Important issue. So we're running out of time. What also happens at the same time, I'm skipping through that, is that actually at the same time, or the map doesn't come through, there's also a world map in behind, we are settling still in these places. So this shows you the population increase, basically, driven only up until the year 2040 by, so that's the current population exposure in different parts of the world, in the coastal areas, and that shows you the additional population exposure in the mid-range scenario, SSP 2, 4.5, and the darker ones are the ones that are driven by climate change and by sea level rise. The lighter ones are the ones which are driven by population in these places, population increase. So urbanization, for instance, particularly in West Africa, many parts of East Asia, Southeast Asia, in highly exposed areas. Okay, how do we need to change planning law, for instance, to shift this around? To not settle in areas which will become flood exposed in 20 years from now. Very important point. So this speaks to exposure. So we have to think about the hazards itself. We have to think about the exposure and what we as societies do to increase exposure. We also have to think about vulnerability. How vulnerable are different parts of the society? And if you see here, that's a little bit of an older picture. Back in the years when I was still leading at United Nations University, the World Risk Report. But the picture hasn't changed much, basically. It's the question of countries urbanizing and how quickly they're urbanizing and what sort of starting urbanization level they have. And then we did an index of social vulnerability. Do countries have healthcare? Do they have social protection systems and so forth? And you see here a quite divided picture. Those countries, and here we look only into the urban areas with the highest vulnerability classes, so the highest social vulnerability, the most marginalization, most poverty, less social security systems and so forth, are those in countries with very rapid growth. So this is really where things come together, oftentimes. High exposure growth, high vulnerability growth, and lots of climate hazards at the same time. And we have a certain issue here, also a little bit of an older number, but also still pretty much the case. A peek into the current report, that picture hasn't changed much. We need to understand small and mid-sized cities. We look into the mega cities all the time, but actually in the small and mid-sized cities, this is actually where high vulnerability, high population growth, and less capacity really come together. These are not the cities where the brightest people of the universities go to because they want to, in Indonesia, for instance, where I work a lot, because they want to work in the ministries in Jakarta. They don't go to Kalimantan, to the small and mid-sized places, so they have a lack of political attention, investment, capital, human resources, but this is actually where risk grows the most. So the question is, how good are we on track in responding to that? And I need to speed up a little bit, but I think the next 2 blocks will be a bit quicker. We did an assessment basically going through loads and loads of papers, something for the junior scientists in the room, an interesting thing. We have loads of case studies, as you could see from the other picture, Do we learn on a meta level? Do we have the meta level science, synthesis science that we need? Very strong people in Berlin doing that, Jan Minks and others actually working on that sort of thing. And we jointly did something which we call the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, running through the peer-reviewed literature and thousands of case studies. What do we learn? Are we on track? And basically, we were interested in a couple of things. Is our adaptation deep enough? Do we roll it out in terms of scope? Do we, for instance, do mainstreaming into legislation in order to roll out things, for instance, through spatial planning, social protection law, and so forth? And are we fast enough? And basically, the bottom line is, if you see here the different sectors that we needed to report, in my chapter, in the main assessment report here, chapter 16, different sectors, and then these different categories, and how much evidence we have that this is happening at a higher level, so with more depth, with more speed and so forth, and how confident we are, based on the confidence language, you see not so much dark there, which means actually there's not so much deep and quick change happening as of yet. There's a lot of experimentation happening, also if you look into cities in particular, but by and large, we are not quick enough, we are not deep enough, and we are not consolidated enough in order to really effectively respond to these emerging and rising risks, okay? And that's something, it's closing a little bit, I can tell you from the current report, but still we have a huge gap there. Also because actually risks are moving quicker than we thought, okay? There's more multi-complex risk and so forth in the system than we thought. We did an assessment, again, I work a lot on coastal cities, specifically for what we know on coastal cities. Read it up if you're interested. Bottom line, similar thing here. Even in the adaptation frontiers, where all the attention goes to, a lot of the funding goes to the Londons of the world, the New Yorks of the world, the Singapores of the world, even there we have a problem. We are not quick enough, we are not fast enough, and so forth. And we are not even doing the right thing. If you now think about, I told you something about hazard and exposure and vulnerability. If you now think about what is currently going into adaptation planning, then it's mostly future assumptions of trends and hazards, flood modeling, for instance. What we don't do very well is actually to understand how does, for instance, our social vulnerability change, social cohesion, social security networks, and so forth. They don't go into our planning, and we draw numbers on, for instance, what do we need in terms of storm evacuation shelters, protection systems, flood protection, and so forth. What do we need in 20 years from now? But we have a skewed assessment here. So a field I work in a lot, how do we do scenarios of future exposure and future vulnerability? In Germany, for instance, it's not legally mandatory in the planning law to do that, and hence we are a little bit imbalanced in that respect. Okay, I'll shut down here with the last 2 minutes or 1 minute in a couple of examples on what that means now for concrete localities. I told you now a lot about the Global South, about Africa and Asia. I was also asked to talk a little bit about Germany where possible, and we have projects in all parts of the world. But for instance, I was leading also a project here in, it was mentioned, I was working, leading a chair at Ludwig-Maximilians University, and we worked in the Bavarian Oberland region. And they have a lot of flash floods and a lot of heavy precipitation events, and we looked in small and mid-sized cities like Garmisch-Partenkirchen. This is the 100-year flood event and the riverine floods, and the city invested a lot of money into making itself flood-proof. In comes the R Valley event, and all of a sudden you see, wait a minute, the 1,000-year flood event is no longer just something for for our planning boards, but it's something that can happen, and this is the situation. And then in comes flash floods, and you see other parts of the city here where it's coming down from the mountains, other parts of the city are quite involved. So how do you possibly adapt even in a very rich setting for a change now? Also interesting for us to discuss. One of the richest settings in Germany. How do you adapt there? One of the ways forward was we need more information. We need, for instance, something that the British did many years ago, to say we need to model even flash floods much more thoroughly. We need to bring them into planning legislation, which they're currently not, and we need to inform the population that they might be exposed. Here we go. We asked in the report the mayors in this part of Germany, if you had these maps, would you actually go forward and publish them? And that has a very much of a legal, state, non-state legal interface question. What would you do? Would you make it legally binding, for instance, to publish these maps? Would you make it legally binding for the population to react on these maps? Well, we are not so sure. say most of the governance, even though we want to have these maps. But if we do that, wait a minute, there might be high expectations towards what we can do as a city board or as a municipal board. Citizens might be overreacting and so forth. So it's quite some interesting result. Then we say, okay, after the R-Valley event, always these discussions in Germany come up. I just give you a couple of flashlights here on interesting findings for the discussion. How about a mandatory flood risk insurance? No, population will not like this. They will not go ahead. Here we ask 1,600 households in the same region, would you actually be supportive of a house owner, a compulsory house owner's flood risk insurance? And they are quite supportive of it, actually. Even though you can see also, if you look at the bottom line, there's quite some inconsistencies in how people respond, so we could possibly talk half an hour just about that empirical finding here, but I'll not do that. I'll come to close because my time is up. I have maybe 30 seconds left, and a couple of conclusions before we go to the discussion. Yes, urban climate change adaptation efforts are on the rise across the globe. We see a lot of experimentation driven by C40, by ICLEI and others also, and that is good. But it's not enough. We are not moving at the sufficient speed, scope, and depth that we need. And of course, the question in the room is, can, for instance, a legal change help to support that? Many adaptation barriers exist on the ground, and these are largely institutional, often also legal. We can discuss that. It's important to show in different empirical cases, actually, what knowledge gaps are there and what sort of difficult choices oftentimes urban planners and adaptation practitioners have to make in governance respects. And I would be arguing, but I'll leave that a little bit for the discussion, that even sometimes the way how we ask our questions from a scientific point of view with a conceptual lens, maybe even with a epistemological and methodological lens, is sometimes wrong and is misguided a little bit. We can talk about resilience as a concept, we can talk about a couple of things on the podium, but that might be quite interesting. So we are on a good track. We're not moving fast and deep enough. Question is, how can that be? And that is a scientific endeavor also in itself, understanding and evaluating how that process can be accelerated. And you will find some of that in chapter 3 of this wonderful report and the second order draft. If you're interested, you can register as an expert reviewer, then that will be vetted. But I think with most of you working in that phase or in that space, IPCC should have no difficulty in vetting you successfully. So if you're interested, go to that QR link here and sign up as an expert reviewer for the second order draft. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Garschagen, for these highly informative keynote remarks, which form an excellent basis, of course, and the starting point for our panel discussion this evening. It is truly a pleasure and an honor for me to not only moderate Helmut Aust's first public event at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law, but also to lead our distinguished panelists through this discussion, which then will also be opened up to you, our audience, following an initial round of statements and reactions and an exchange here on the podium. For a short housekeeping remark, we are recording this event tonight, and we are also taking some pictures for the communications of MPIL, and we will also publish it on our YouTube account afterwards. If you have any objections to this, please come up to me after the session tonight, and we will take care of your privacy rights, of course. I'm Alexandra Kemmer. I'm a senior fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg, and also head of the Institute's Berlin office, which is a hub for our interaction with legal practice, with politics, media, NGOs, and of course also numerous research institutions and individual scholars in Berlin and beyond. And it is also a laboratory and incubator for our third mission activities and communications more broadly. As Helmut Aust has highlighted, and as the Impulse presentation we just heard has reaffirmed, any meaningful conversation about cities and climate is indeed an interdisciplinary conversation, or rather, it should be so. It should be an intersubjective endeavor bringing together a variety of disciplinary perspectives and personal positionalities based on an openness to transcend the boundaries of one's discipline while making these boundaries understandable and accessible to others. and also sharing substantive knowledge and methodological insights, as well as normative and epistemic concerns. The panel convened to set out on such an endeavor today brings together an indeed spectacular group of scholars. What better constellation of experts to discuss how urban emissions and risks can be reduced, what role the law, international law, as well as administrative law can and should play, how urban planning and construction can foster resilient and adaptive cities, and how all this can come together productively in a time of pressing planetary challenges that are increasingly to be felt on the ground by everyone and everywhere. Without further ado, I would like to introduce now our panelists who will offer a round of reactions and comments on the keynote remarks by Professor Garshagen. First of all, on the far left, we have Professor Priya Gupta. Priya Gupta is Associate Professor of Law at McGill University in Montreal and currently a visiting scholar at Freie University Berlin at the Freie Universität Berlin Empirical Legal Studies Center Fuels. And she's also, I think, a fellow currently at the Advanced Center of Advanced Studies Reflex at Humboldt University Law School. Professor Gupta's research focuses on the intersections of property law, critical race theory, and capitalism, with particular attention to how property regimes perpetuate racial and economic inequality. And her recent scholarship examines housing access, urban governance, and racial capitalism across jurisdictions, including the United States, Canada, India, and the United Kingdom. Professor Gupta has been actively involved in a number of community-oriented initiatives, including securing government welfare for and with rural populations in India, various voting rights and access projects, and more recently, also in continued service on the board of directors for the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, a large community-based land trust and advocacy group for affordable housing in Toronto, Canada. Then here on my left, we have Professor Christoph Bernhardt. Christoph Bernhardt is a senior fellow at the Leibniz Institute for Research on Society and Space, das Leibniz-Institut für raumbezogene Sozialforschung, IAS in Erkner, here at the productive peripheries of Berlin. And he's working there in the research area Contemporary History and Archives, where he also was a director of this research group until April 2023. He was also deputy director of the IRS from 2019 to 2022. Christoph Bernhardt is an adjunct professor of modern and contemporary history at the Institute of History at Humboldt University, the Faculty of Philosophy. Already in his dissertation, he wrote about urban geographies from historical perspectives. It was titled Bauplatz Groß-Berlin, Wohnungsmärkte, Terraingewerbe und Kommunalpolitik im Städtewachstum der Hochindustrialisierung, Greater Berlin, a construction site of housing markets, real estate development, and local politics in urban growth during the era of high industrialization from 1871 to 1918, which was really a very dynamic period here in Berlin in terms of urban development. Currently, he's particularly interested in interconnections between urbanization, urban climate, and seasonality in transdisciplinary perspective, also in historicization of urban climate transformation, and in cities as centers of knowledge production on climate adaptations. In addition to his research in the fields of European urban and environmental history, he's also committed to transforming the academic system towards sustainable and resource-conserving practices. Then I would like to introduce also Dr. Anne Holsten. Anne Holsten is a senior researcher and project coordinator at Bauhaus Erde, Bauhaus Earth in Stuttgart, and an associate member of the Cluster of Excellence Integrative Computational Design and Construction for Transformative Architecture, INT-CDC. Dr. Holsten holds a PhD in geoecology and previously worked as a project coordinator at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, also at the productive peripheries of Berlin, where she researched climate change impacts, regional vulnerabilities, and emission reduction potentials across sectors, including buildings, forestry, biodiversity conservation, and health. At Bauhaus Earth, Bauhaus Erde, a truly interdisciplinary place and a space of thinkers and makers, she specializes in quantifying the availability and environmental benefits of nature-based construction materials and leads scenario-based research on the future global supply and demand for materials with the aim of meeting housing needs while transforming the built environment from carbon emitter into a carbon sink. Especially, I think the practice of scenario building is something where lawyers can also learn a lot from, and maybe also administrative lawyers, as our last but not least panelist, Professor Angela Schwertfeger. Angela Schwertfeger holds the chair of German and European public law with a focus on environmental and climate law at Freie University in Berlin. Previously, she served as professor of public law at Georg-August-Universität in Göttingen. And she serves also since 2021 as a deputy member of the Niedersächsische Staatsgerichtshof, the constitutional court of the Land of Niedersachsen. Already both qualification theses of Angela Schwertfeger give us an idea of her involvement with tonight's topic. Her dissertation was dedicated to administrative legal protection in Germany under the influence of the Aarhus Convention and contributed to the further development of subjective public rights with special reference to European community law. And in her habilitation, her second thesis, she engaged with legislation in crisis and questions of the balance of powers and separation of powers, also an issue that might be tackled in the discussion tonight. Angela Schwertfeger is one of the foremost administrative lawyers today in Germany, and the impact of her work truly goes beyond Freie Universität, because she's also the editor of an, I would say, indispensable textbook and casebook in public law, Der Schwertfeger, öffentliches Recht in der Fallbearbeitung, which is now Schwertfeger. So she's really a person who kind of brings the insights of tonight to the ground and to legal practice for future generations. So it's a pleasure to have you all here, and I would now like to invite Priya Gupta to start with her comments.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, and also really thank you very much to Professor Garjagan for your really important work. It's a service to all of us. My comments are focused on climate change in the context of financial and racial capitalism in the city. So in the publicly made outline, the report says it'll discuss urban systems and climate risks, including compounding risks. We already had a bit of an introduction to that just now with chapter 3. Climate resilient urban development, and cities as hotspots of effects of hazards and emissions and vulnerabilities, which I suppose my remarks will focus on as well. The report also says that it will include a discussion of structural inequity, gender, colonialism, and justice. Oh, sorry, I meant to say I'll keep my own time. So I thought I would say a few words about the differential impacts of climate change in cities, with an eye to sketching how these conditions get compounded over time, specifically for racialized populations. Of course, it would be important to do this analysis as well, based on gender and disability. Climate conditions get compounded over time because of, in this discussion, structures of racial capitalism in the city. Sociologist Prentice Danzler has argued that urbanization itself is not colorblind. It is predicated upon the exploitation of people of color. So we can widen the context there a moment and think about how, if capitalism itself is dependent on racial exploitation, then so too must urbanization. And therefore, our analysis of capital accumulation through urbanization and through its destruction, and perhaps also sometimes through its reconstruction, should take into account who gets to inscribe their interests and who gets to take value from the city, and whose spaces are taken and whose spaces are devalued in some ways. And of course, in many places we know that spaces where racialized people live are increasingly expropriated or made difficult to access, either through outright displacement, transport, or entry costs. With regard to climate change, we see how racialized people's spaces are increasingly made unlivable, even as others profit from that destruction. So I thought what I would do is sketch out the experience of one neighborhood in particular, just to show what it means to have structural inequity, because I think sometimes the word structure is used in a way but not actually defined and not actually delineated as such. And that place is Altadena, California. So Altadena is a small city next to Pasadena within LA. The population is around 40,000 people. It was inhabited by two sets of indigenous communities, the Tongva and the Hauanga, for hundreds of years before settlers came. And the reason why I'm talking about it today is because I think it illustrates a kind of terrible coalescing of climate change, of finance and insurance, of the state role, of race, and also of the kind of tearing of the social cohesion that the professor referred to, and the inability of funding or of other state possibilities to make up for what's lost. Altadena in the early 20th century was incidentally home to a number of millionaires who lived in California. And then later during the 1940s and 50s, it became the home to quite a number of people from the Black community in LA. And this was because of practices of redlining, where Black people were often shut out of mortgages through a number of processes that we won't talk about today. They ended up, though, being able to live in Altadena, and they stayed there generationally. So there was some generational wealth that built up in this community. In 2022, I just wanted to mention that Altadena became one of the very few places where there was an example of land back, where a community member actually gifted around 1 acre of land to the Tongva. And this ended up being the first time in 200 years where the tribe had legally regained land in LA County. So in January 2025, there were very terrible wildfires across Pacific Palisades and Pasadena and Altadena. And you might have heard of these, and you might have heard them referred to as Eaton fires. So overall, the estimates of economic damages from the fires are now over $50 billion. In Altadena alone, over 1,000 buildings and 16,000 acres burned. And if you look at the pictures of it, it looks like a war zone. So in terms of insurance, residents of Altadena had been facing higher and higher rates. And just before the fire, the summer before the fire, a number of them had their home insurance canceled by the insurance companies, who said that they would not renew the policies. There are news reports that when these residents tried to call other insurance brokers, they were told that now the zip codes were closed, meaning that private insurance companies would no longer insure homes in those zip codes because of the possibility or their likelihood of wildfires. NPR reported that over the past few years, tens of thousands of Californians face this situation, as many of the big insurance companies have pulled out of their zip codes and wildfires have intensified. So because of this, they're forced to turn to insurers of last resort, which typically cost more and offer less coverage, a situation that ends up being devastating for the people of Altadena right now. Even those who had insurance now face difficulty regarding payouts. So there's been lots of reports of people having a back and forth with the insurance companies who refuse to pay out or end up minimizing the payouts on claims. The Guardian also reported that some of the insurance companies have employed freelancers to adjust or computer programs designed to cut costs more than to help consumers. So I think what this illustrates is a confluence of events that also shows law's inability to respond adequately right now. There are state insurance companies that try to make up the difference, state insurance programs, I should say, but they're, of course, woefully inadequate for what people have lost in the fires. And I'll just close by one illustration from the New York Times that I think shows what it means to say that racial capitalism is structural and that it works perhaps as an axis in terms of climate change effects. "I feel I'm stuck," said Kareem Jamie, 50, whose home of 25 years of West Altadena survived the Eaton fire, but was rendered uninhabitable by wind damage and ensuing lead and asbestos contamination. So again, think about when you have an event like a fire or flood, of course, there's lots of other knock-on events that follow. She said that her insurer, Allstate, had not paid any living expenses since February, claiming that the documentation was insufficient. Allstate declined to talk to the reporters, but said that they had already paid out more than $1.2 billion to other customers. She and her husband have exhausted their savings and they've maxed out their credit cards, and they're now renting in nearby Pasadena along with her nearly 80-year-old mother. Because of the fire, the bus company where her husband works lost a contract with the school district, so he now works 2 hours away, and he spends most of his work week in company-provided housing away from the family. When their mortgage forbearance ends this month, She said that they will confront a $30,000 bill for back mortgage payments if they cannot persuade their insurer to retroactively cover their living expenses. Their lender will likely foreclose. And the article goes on. So I'll close there just by pointing out that some of the questions that are raised when we overlay racial capitalism and climate change in the city context are who bears the risk, and of course, how do we define the risk, not just financial, but in terms of life and community. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my turn, yeah. Thank you. I'm happy to be here and to see everybody. The relation between history and the IPCC and the Earth System Sciences is a little bit strange. As far as I know, in the IPCC process, historians are not so much involved. By contrast, the IPCC does a lot of history without historians by doing long-term climate research. So this indicates a reconfiguration of disciplines in the context too. And I will come back to it in my first point. These points are very general, but I hope you will see that they somehow are touching the other statements. If we are today discussing problems of climate change, IPCC, cities, then we do so in a new historical situation in which some recent powerful scientific paradigms frame our debate. I'm talking, you will have known, I'm talking of the Anthropocene and concepts like the Great Acceleration or the planetary boundaries approach. Leading historians like Dipesh Chakrabarty, Jürgen Renn, and many other scholars have voted for a new type of transformative research. That's a different type of research that historiography has done until only recently to respond to today's global challenges. So my first, and it's a very general question, would be what kind of knowledge and transformative research does the IPCC process represent in its real impact and interrelations? Setting standards for research, pushing policymakers to certain actions, informing a wider public on innovative ideas. Matthias has touched some of these questions. We could perhaps enlarge it and come back to them. In a somehow similar perspective, in 2016, the slogan "Unlocking the Transformative Power of Cities" was coined, which was the subtitle of the major flagship report, Humanity on the Move, of the German Advisory Council on Global Change, WBGU. This report was obviously a similar undertaking, if I'm not wrong, like the current IPCC report on cities, so it could be interesting to learn something about its impact, to understand the consequences of such reports, and maybe Anna will be able to say something on it, and maybe she will know better than me. My second point addresses the role of case studies, types of cities, urban pathways, and path dependencies, which seem to be cornerstones and methodological key concepts of such reports. Here, very general problems of selection, typology, and generalization of single cases are relevant and challenging. If we just take as a snapshot the very special case of Berlin, we find that the reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions since 1990 by about 13% was strongly determined by the collapse of the former socialist industries, as we all know. In other words, by Berlin's specific historical pathway in the 20th century. If we would try to contrast the Berlin case with the pathway of Mumbai, which was labeled, I cite, from colonial city to globally connected megacity by the WBGU, or that of Cairo, located between authoritarian state and weak governance, then of course very different pathways become apparent, and the political systems and socio-cultural settings of cities, which really very much influence the chances to implement measures, they play a major role in my thinking. Reflecting on pathways and scenarios is very helpful, but there's a large variety and difference between socio-economic pathways of cities, path dependencies in the mentalities of urban societies, which is a very important thing, or trajectories of mitigation and adaptation planning. As a third point, I want to briefly address the role of informal urbanization, which today dominates urban development in the global south. We know this type of urbanization, which is very difficult to study empirically, from European history. And we also know that it triggers serious social problems like lack of housing, poor sanitary conditions and poor public transport, and all kinds of environmental and climate problems. Experiences from informal urbanization around Paris, Vienna, or Istanbul in the 20th century suggest that it needs a mix of self-organization and self-help, top-down planning and central state funding to successfully deal with such problems. A well-balanced governance across political scales, from local civil societies up to global organization, has to be developed, in which formal institutions and modern technologies that we know from European states and cities have to be redesigned or even abandoned. Here, besides problems of scale, questions of knowledge transfer from the global south to the global north and vice versa become critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to hand over immediately to Anne Holsten.
Is this working already? Yeah? Okay. Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. And thank you for giving us sort of the latest insight into where we stand with adaptation and climate change. And please allow me to move over to the other side, to the mitigation part. Because what we are concerned with really what we call sort of the elephant in the room in terms of climate change mitigation, and that's the construction sector. That makes up almost 40% of the global CO2 emissions. So that's really what we need to talk about and what we need to tackle for climate change mitigation. Now I want to go a bit into this to understand where I'm getting at with the solutions. If we look at these emissions from the construction sector, 2/3 of it is actually, and that's the good news, is sort of related to the operational emissions. So that's essentially heating and cooling of our buildings. But that part is actually declining because we've really invested in energy efficiency measures, greening of the electricity grids and so on. But still 1/3 of this bulk of emissions from the construction sector is what we call embodied emissions. So these are related to the material extraction of building materials, manufacturing, and so the actual construction processes. And that part of the cake, basically, that's actually becoming more and more relevant now. In highly efficient buildings, that piece of cake would actually really go up to more than 50 or 75% of the building because we're getting more efficient in the use. But for decades, we've actually been focusing with the policies, I'm looking here around as well, on the operational emissions and not so much focusing on with what material we actually build our buildings. And this is especially relevant in the climate change mitigation debate because that causes sort of a carbon spike of construction. So actually a lot of the damage of construction in cities is done before you actually sort of open the house. So that's really relevant for the short and mid-term mitigation goals. So the challenge is, of course, related to the emissions of materials and to the sheer mass of materials that are related to construction. Cities now already consume 70 to 75% of the global resources. And just to put it in perspective, I think an interesting fact is that the anthropogenic mass, so the sort of the mass that we have altered as humans, has already exceeded the whole biomass of the planet. And that mass is essentially almost concrete, aggregates, and bricks. So this is really
yeah, really a lot that we need to tackle. So, and let's think that together with urbanization processes in the future. Urbanization in terms of increase in building floor areas in cities. Building floor areas actually projected to double until 2060. That means half of the building stock of the future is not yet built. And if we now combine that with the urbanization processes, we know that a large bulk of that will actually happen in the global south. So we really need to look at that. So if we meet this massive demand for housing in the future, and if we continue to build with our conventional materials like cement and concrete, we really run into a severe crisis in terms of the carbon budget. A friend of mine just published an interesting paper for your report, maybe, and she actually signed up as a reviewer, as I know, that if we continue to build as we do with cement and steel construction, the construction sector alone will actually eat up the whole carbon budget until the mid of this century, even if all other sectors would reduce to zero, which is, of course, unrealistic. So to stay within the climate targets, the sector must essentially decarbonize. And that's a huge challenge. So what do we need? And we really need a paradigm shift in terms of how we build our buildings and cities, to turn the cities from a driver of the climate crisis into a regenerative force. So we really must look beyond the operational emissions of the buildings and address the physical materials that make up our urban fabric. As our founder, Professor John Schellnhuber, whom I think you've met, recently emphasized, we can literally build our way out of this crisis using bio-based materials. So we could transform the cities into something that he called built forests, or the bio-based city, to act as a sort of repair tool for the environment, making use of the photosynthesis, so the plants that are actually actively drawn carbon out of the atmosphere before. And if you channel these materials into the cities of our future, they could actually act as long-term carbon sinks. And at the same time, substitute these really high emission-intense carbon and building materials that we're still using. But that also means that we shouldn't treat cities as sort of isolated entities in the whole solution, but they're so interlinked to their surrounding landscapes. If we want to build with different materials, we really need to think where these materials are coming from. We need to entangle our cities again to the surrounding landscapes. And that maybe is also some historical reflection that we can discuss, yeah, because that connection used to be stronger. And so for this, we really need to urgently develop solutions on the ground, but also develop the science for it. And you mentioned the difference between the consumption-based approaches of carbon accounting and the territorial approaches. So if we really want to grasp this problem of the construction sector, what we need is to account for these emissions in a consumption-based principle. And there are still too few studies out there, unfortunately. So I'll leave it with that, and I'm happy to do this.
Thank you. And on to Professor Schwertfeger.
Okay, so first, thank you for the invitation, and also thank you for all the interesting insights from my co-panelists. So I have the task to shed some lights on the German legal framework for climate change, mitigation and adaptation actions by cities, and you can imagine that this is really a wide field. So I would restrict myself to 3 dimensions, so to the relevant powers of cities, to legal instruments, and to the actors, and I will just touch on certain aspects of that. So first, coming to the relevant powers of cities. Cities can act within the framework which is set by federal and state legislation, and they also have to take into consideration the binding EU law, so for example, the Renewable Energies Directive or the Nature Restoration Regulation. And there's a wide range of areas of law that are relevant here. So we've already heard about, for example, urban planning law, but there are other subjects as the local energy support, urban transport, waste, so the circular economy. And So I cannot go into detail here, but I just want to mention that if you have a look at all these areas of law, you will see that we are talking rather about powers of cities and not of duties. So no precise obligations, duties, but powers and possibilities, what they can do. And I think that I can refer here a little bit to the keynote, because this is why climate-related actions of cities depend a lot on the local political will, and this is why they are so diverse in what happens in the end. And another reason for that is also the limited financial resources of the different cities. So I will now come to the legal instruments, and also there I just want to highlight two aspects that are linked also to the draft report, which I had the pleasure to have a look at already. So the first refers to the character of climate change mitigation and adaptation as cross-functional tasks. We have already seen now that climate mitigation and adaptation is a topic of a wide range of areas of law. And so I just want to mention one instrument which is precisely dealing with these aspects. And these are the so-called consideration requirements. So in German, Berücksichtigungsgebote. These shall guarantee the consideration of climate change, mitigation and also adaptation in all the different areas of law. And this instrument has become quite famous within the last few years. There have already been a lot of special consideration requirements, for example, in urban planning law. But the turning point was the introduction of a general consideration requirement in the Federal Climate Action Act in 2019. And I've brought the wording for you. So it states, bodies discharging public duties must give due consideration in their planning and decisions to the purpose of this act and to the targets set for its implementation. So you see a very wide formulation. And there's a similar provision in the Federal Climate Adaptation Act and also in state legislation. And the second aspect with reference to the instruments is that the draft report also points to the competing interests. So it states that we should maximize the co-benefits while minimizing trade-offs, and that we've also taken into consideration climate justice. And if you have a look only at mitigation and adaptation measures, you can already see that there are synergies but also conflicts between both of them. Take, for example, the competition for space. If you have requirements for solar panels, for example, on the one hand, and requirements for green roofs, this doesn't work at the same time. And of course, there are a lot of other interests that have to be taken into account and that can compete with climate-related issues. And at this point, I want to emphasize another instrument, or I want to emphasize that this is also why planning law is so important in climate litigation and adaptation, because a hallmark of planning law is the balancing of interest. And this includes climate mitigation, adaptation, but also social and economic interests. And so I come to my last dimension, to the actors, and there I just want to focus on civil society, on NGOs and individuals. And I want to give some examples for involvement and possible involvements and possible influences of civil society and individuals. And one example is the Berlin Climate Adaptation Act, because this one originated from a citizens' initiative, the so-called Baumentscheid, which was adopted by the Berlin House of Representatives, even without a referendum being necessary in the end. And coming back to the keynote, I just want to emphasize that there are a lot of provisions in that act dealing with transparency and the publication of data and duties like that. My second point concerning civil society and actors is public participation. We've already heard about that beforehand in the keynote. Public participation, which is a broad concept in German law as well, which follows also from the Aarhus Convention, a contract I dealt with in my PhD thesis. And I just want to come back the problems that can, or not the problems, but the counterpart of participation. So participation takes time, and we've already heard that it's quite urgent to act. So at the moment, there's kind of a conflict between public participation and acceleration, and this is one example for that is the Renewable Energies Directive. So the Renewable Energies Directive restricts public participation at the project level for accelerating the development of renewable energy. So this is also one interesting point, I think. And my last point with regard to civil society, NGOs and individuals is that also climate litigation by NGOs and by individuals influences climate mitigation and climate adaptation measures. And I just want to give the examples of court decisions obliging cities to develop or update their air quality plans. So that's all from my side.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you to all the panelists for sharing their expertise and their observations. I would like to ask you, Professor Garschagen, did you hear anything what you feel compelled to include still into the report, or was this all familiar to you to some extent?
I think loads and loads of interesting points, and many we have sort of addressed already in the report, but many which are sort of without the final answer, let's say, many of which were the literature is sort of struggling, and we bring up interesting questions, but not so much, what's the perfect answer is sort of the thing. No, I mean, I could go through. I think it's maybe just very quickly to respond to a couple of things. I think what Priya mentioned. I think that how do we address that very deep structural inequality dimension that often drives vulnerability. By the way, also the lack of capacity to deal with mitigation at the same time. So I think that's actually where the big transformation debate in the adaptation space comes from, driven by your former or by your current boss or former boss. The great transformation in the WBGU report, very much thought of initially as a mitigation concept, but for us in the vulnerabilities field, since 30, 40, 50 years, it's been really discussed as something, how do you not perpetuate the same vulnerabilities, but how do you deeply actually transform? And that actually brings an interesting point that you brought up, what is then the role of the IPCC, and how can the IPCC sort of shape debates or not? It's actually quite tricky, to be honest, to, for instance, even think about or talk about things like transformation with governments. Many governments are quite nervous about transformations. One of the most difficult terms actually to get approved. What is always our safe ground is to say it's debated in the literature. So that's actually, the literature is very firm on saying if we don't get deeper transformations going, then we don't stand a chance in actually tackling root causes of vulnerability, tackling root causes of emissions and so forth, cutting loose from path dependencies and so forth. So that's the firm ground. So we're always quite happy to also be pointed towards the right literature there. But that's sort of the tricky thing. And that, by the way, has become more and more politicized, of course. IPCC originally sort of as a thing, let's ask the scientists, and then we take that into our political debates at COPs and other things. Now, approval sessions of the IPCC have become more like mini COPs, a little bit, where a lot of the debating, but that's, you can also read it as a very powerful tool. Obviously, the world is still listening to science, and it makes a difference what scientists say and what not, and what policy you can sort of do or not do against science. So that's maybe still the positive thing. Maybe just one or two other thoughts. Of course, I think the big building question is very obvious. I'm not a mitigation person, so I think we can discuss that forth and back. Wouldn't you think that, for instance, when it comes to the building sector, the picture is even more bleak? I mean, you've already pointed towards a very difficult situation, but for instance, from an adaptation point of view, I would say, I mean, with the operational costs, think about air conditioning. One of the key trade-offs we're basically trying to highlight in the report. The second order draft is not too strong on it yet, but I think we will, see massive increases actually in energy demands, for instance, in buildings still. So that really gives me, headaches. Actually, what do we ever cut the corner there, or is that what are the solutions potentially? And then, of course, I mean, on all the legal aspects, exactly. I think there would be so much to debate on Berücksichtigungsverbote and whether they are sharp enough. That's precisely in the German context, I think, what we need. But I think I would just like to highlight one key thing. You also mentioned the trade-offs and the synergies. I think in the last assessment cycle, we sort of ended on a communication strategy, which I found sometimes problematic, which is there's all sorts of co-benefits and synergies which are there, and the literature is full of them, but there's also trade-offs. And we were a little bit detached from real decision makers on the ground who always told me, wait a minute, I have to navigate trade-offs from morning to evening. It's about navigating trade-offs. I can build a new kindergarten, or I can invest into a public greening strategy. I can't do it both. Maybe there's a little bit of synergies in between, but in Berlin you can't do it both at the same time, for instance. Or the trade-offs, for instance, in the coastal cities I talked to. If they get serious about coastal protection, and some of them will have to, grey infrastructure is going to be a part of it. It's not only going to be green infrastructure, for instance, and the grey infrastructure is going to destroy, that cuts back to your point, and that will destroy the mitigation, or the emissions balance sheet, basically. So I think we also need to be very honest about providing the best science on how to navigate trade-offs, and not just to say from a high sort of sometimes normative force, the world is full of co-benefits, and if policymakers don't see it, they haven't understood science. Whereas many scientists say, no, I see the co-benefits, but I also see the trade-offs, and I saw too little of the trade-off discussion in the scientific literature vis-a-vis the IPCC report. So what can we as scientists also do to say, yes, we have understood? For instance, leverage point ideas. How do you line up a process where you say, if a city like Berlin can invest in a 4-year election cycle into certain things with a very limited budget, what is the smartest way to do certain things first in order to unlock change in the next domain, and that sort of thing. Yeah? So I think that's something where the literature is still surprisingly thin, actually, to be honest, is our observation. But I'm happy to learn that we just haven't looked in the right corners of the literature. But I think that's something where we really need to become much better. And I think that cuts across many disciplines. My own discipline, geography, planning, and so forth, maybe also legal studies, I don't know, but it would be interesting to learn, is there sort of literature on how to line up a process in how to, navigate trade-offs and maximize sort of what can be changed. That would be quite interesting. Can we learn from historians, actually, on how to do that and what has worked, what has not worked, how to get transformations going, and if you have very limited resources. And I think that's the reality of things, not just here in this part of the world, but in all parts of the world, or we could turn it upside down. Now we are in a situation where even in this part of the world, we really have to talk about limited resources. It's no longer that sort of Schlaraffenland idea that we can just pick from the options table and doing risk reduction and emissions reduction. It's really a fight for resources and political attention. How to do it best in that constellation is, I think, a key challenge which the literature is not very honest about yet.
Yeah, I'm also confronted with a trade-off situation. We have a great panel, but only limited time. And therefore, I would like to open up already now for questions from the audience and then give you a chance to respond. And then, of course, we will also have a final round. But this was already quite intriguing as an observation, as a response. So are there any questions from your side? Not for the moment, or? No. Yeah, then I would like to move to you, Priya, for a minute. I mean, you described situations of gross inequality in your example from the Californian wildfires, but could you observe, I mean, since you have done also community-oriented work on different regions of the world, including the Global South, are there any examples or practices where you could see some strings of hope for navigating trade-off situations in a democratic way and in a participatory way?
Oh, thank you. This is a really hard question to ask me about hope in this context. I will say one example that I had considered also presenting, but I didn't want to overload two really contrasting examples. So in late 2025, Canada released its like federal level model building code guideline. So generally pretty technocratic, maybe not the first thing that we might read about, but actually they were really important. I'm trying not to use the word groundbreaking anymore. I think it's a really violent word. So they were really significant because for the first time, they recognized that the environment isn't static. So now the building codes the model building codes are designed around the idea that the climate will be changing in certain ways. And this, I think, could only happen because there were many NGO reports and agency reports that pushed them to do this. And in 2023, Vancouver had released their model building codes. No, British Columbia, sorry. British Columbia had released their provincial building code model format, and they had recognized this. So they had taken this important step to say, now when we're designing buildings and we're putting out model codes, we have to take into account that we are going to face not just flood risk, but increased flood risk or increased fire risk or so on. And I think, to me, that was actually pretty hopeful that when Canada was going to put out the building codes, all of the previous press had said it's expected that they will continue to think of buildings as existing in a static environment. But then British Columbia did this. And then there were a bunch of other reports that came out. And I thought, oh, actually, maybe something can actually shift. Because these are actually the kind of technocratic guidelines that I think are followed. I mean, you actually might know more. But in my experience, that you can justify your construction project, or you might be able to more likely to get the permit if you're following the model building codes. And so it was actually, I think, a nice step forward.
Yeah, Angela Schwertfeger, I think this has also been addressed to you, the question of participation or developing participatory models under time constraint. So how do we manage in a very limited time span where also the issue of intergenerational justice might not echo with everyone or the majority in society, to develop models of decision making that are justified or also meet our normative expectations in a democratic society?
Yeah, so I mean, this is also a trade-off, certainly. So, and especially, so I was talking about the administrative participation, so about administrative decisions. So so I would just come to that, and then I will come to the second point. Concerning administrative law, for the example I gave, so maybe I could just elaborate a little bit more on that for a better understanding. It concerned the Renewable Energies Directive and the acceleration of developing renewable energies. And well, maybe I was a little bit, I didn't tell the whole truth on that, because it's not that participation doesn't take place at all. It's just that they restricted public participation to the planning level. So the first level where it's decided where, for example, wind energy shall be placed in the landscape and so on. And so their public participation still takes place. And then, but on the project level, when there's the decision, the permit for the special wind turbine, then there's no participation anymore. So maybe this can also be taken like a trade-off. They don't cancel all public participation, but they try to be fast, and so they just cut it to one level. So this is the administrative part. And what you referred to, Alexandra, is I think is also a question of legislation, because it's about considering the interests of future generations of young people. And this is something which is already necessary on the legislative level. And I mean, there are huge discussions on that, and it's the problem is that there's no, I mean, people that are not yet born, they cannot vote their representatives. So it's quite hard. There's a lot of discussion on finding concepts, for example, how you can introduce these interests. But in the end, I mean, it's still in our democratic system, it's still like the vote of those that can take part in the elections. And so it also has to do something to do with altruistic views if you're willing to consider these interests. And maybe a last remark on that. I think there's also, this is one reason for kind of I would not say compensation, but maybe something similar to that. If you look at climate litigation, for example, because it's now also the courts taking into consideration the interests of younger people or also of generations unborn. And so one reason for that might also be like this, this problem of being underrepresented in the democratic processes.
If I might just get back on this for a moment. You mentioned climate litigation, but of course this raises also issues of the balance of power, as we know. I mean, courts can only do so much, and there's a question to what extent is it justified and how legitimate is it for courts to intervene. So, of course, climate litigation is also a means of communication, one could say, because you can bring in a lot of also scientific information, evidence, as also the International Court of Justice, as Helmut mentioned it in his introduction, has done recently. But still, there are questions that you also raised, Matthias, just now, of to what extent can science determine legal and political decision-making, and how do we balance this with democratic normativities?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so this would be enough for another panel, I think. So climate litigation and also, the question of the separation of powers. So just maybe some remarks on that. I think you really have to look at each decision. So I think there are some decisions that really go beyond the role of courts, but there are other decisions that really try to emphasize that that it's the responsibility of the legislator. So, for example, in my view, the German climate decision was a decision that did not like go so far as saying, so we are the judges and we now decide how it should be. But they told the legislator that the legislator had done not enough, and that it was for the legislator to act again. And so I think I think you really have to have a close look on the decisions. There are some decisions that go very far, and there are others that really try to point at the responsibility of legislation. And I wanted to say a second thing, but I forgot. Was there another question of yours in the end? No. Okay, so we will leave it at that.
Christoph Bernhardt, you listen now for a while, and there have been once and again questions, little side questions coming up as to the historical perspective. I mean, you worked on the urban expansion of Berlin in a period where also questions of administrative regulation and zoning and so on and so forth played a major role. Of course, Berlin has also been a space where in the 1930s we had projects of urbanization that in a sense also responded to transnational discourse with the New Deal and urbanization processes in other parts of the world. But here we had also different political and constitutional setups. Should we look further back maybe in earlier periods in history to find examples that are speaking to our demands or our challenges today?
Yeah, there can be many answers to this. I would argue that we could look in a bit more general way than you put it on types of regimes, types of governance patterns. Berlin before First World War was a liberal regime, and we could, in a very global cross long trade perspective, we could reflect on how is the situation in liberal capitalistic regimes. But in the debate before, we had different regimes, or you briefly touched on different regimes, some more sustainable, perhaps. So, and this, I'm sorry, I'm turning a bit, brings me to the question: what knowledge could we mobilize? Perhaps, for example, how to live and produce with limited resources. You raised this question. What knowledge could we mobilize? It might be historical knowledge, because managing water in desert areas, there is high indigenous knowledge how to deal with it, and with other resources. So, and one of my questions when I listened to you, Anna, was this biomass idea. Is it a technocratic one, or is it connected to certain, let's say, practices in the areas where it's important to use? So there's a general question in the debate. How far can regulation, Western, German, European planning ideas be realized, and what are other very strong forces, especially in other parts of the world, so that we can't generalize our relatively strong planning system and transfer to other regions?
May I just, thanks. That's actually a really, really relevant topic if you talk about with what building material we should build in the future. I mean, our cities used to be built with the materials of our surrounding. We had our bricks made in the surrounding of Berlin. You probably know better. I'm a new Berliner. But how do we get there? And it's not just about legislation. It's not just about the rules of how to build the Bauordnung. It's about a lot also about acceptance of materials, and acceptance and sort of also of the aesthetics and the social acceptance of certain construction practices and materials. And that's especially relevant in the Global South, actually. So this how material and construction is perceived is often, and there's a whole social context around it, like a poor man's material, or there's a sort of historical context with it. So there are barriers that are really beyond the actual laws or regulations that sometimes need to be overcome. So you need to make that material actually an aspiring material. And that's the challenge. It's not just about availability, it's not just about the laws, it's not just about the cost, but it's also about the social acceptance. And that makes it extremely challenging.
If we think about how to do this, to what extent can education also contribute to this? I mean, that maybe goes back to Angela again, who is training young lawyers in construction law and Baurecht and Bauordnungsrecht, Bauplanungsrecht. So for me, it's a long time that I studied these fields, so I have no insight on to what extent current challenges are discussed, and whether there are also opportunities to take up such issues as to what materials are we drawing from, what is the climate balance of these materials, and should we have maybe more of a variety in terms of also including traditional or local materials when we think about construction?
Okay, so some thoughts on legal education. I think, concerning your question, I would say that like in our courses on building law, we're like rather concentrating on the legal aspects and not so much on the things behind. But this gives me the chance to mention a project which I found quite interesting when I was in Melbourne a few weeks or month ago, which made me think about also changing a little bit the perspective in teaching. But I have to say that in German legal education, I mean, there are not so much possibilities to open up the perspective in the core subjects which you have to teach for the state examination, but there are opportunities to do so in the specialization areas. And so I just want to mention the project I learned about in Melbourne. So there's an initiative which is called Conscious Climate Lawyering. And this initiative is thinking about how to teach young lawyers a different perspective on climate law, and also like, well, it's the understanding of that we are educating the lawyers of tomorrow who might build up legislation and so on. And so this is a huge initiative discussing how to bring like these creative elements into education, which I think is quite interesting. And they are also, they are not trying to just like sticking to climate adaptation and litigation, but they are thinking about showing how in each area of law climate plays a role, and to bring that to the students. And they also created an open access textbook. I think that compared, for example, to the Australian system, we have much, so we don't have so much leeway because of the German state examination. So education is like very strict in the main courses, but I think there's a lot of room in the specialization areas, and this should be an area where I at least want to try to bring a little bit more of this perspective in as well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe education is also an issue for the other panelists here assembled. I mean, also for people training future architects or people working in construction or engineers, and maybe also looking for avenues where you can bring them together with people in the legal field and getting some sense of also the limitations or the considerations of people who are working in a doctrinal legal scheme and think accordingly might be an important issue for people working on construction and materials in order to reframe their thought.
Education actually in that field is a key topic. I mean, many regions lost their skills, a lot of skills on construction practices already. So, and it's not just about learning from sort of historical vernacular skills, but also learning your new technological skills. If we talk about timber, we talk about prefabrication system that's using really high-tech technology. There's the whole education field around that's needed, definitely, and the labor market around it to really build up that knowledge.
Yeah, thank you. In concluding, if each of you could add or could give Matthias Garschagen one sentence to be smuggled into the final report, what would it be?
I'll have to think about it to craft it properly, but I think that, and hopefully the glimpses that I got from the table of contents reflect this, but something about, recognizing the longer histories of structural, like that built the structures of inequity that placed vulnerable populations in a certain position, and how that position only worsens through financial structures that we kind of take for granted. And this actually gets back to the legal education question, if I can say for a minute. I mean, one of the things I really try to do in class, in property class, or I teach a seminar on race and capitalism, is to get students to think what's been cut out of the frame of what they're looking at. Because otherwise, if you end up just practicing a particular area of law, you might just go down it and not even really take the time to consider what facts are not being brought in as relevant to the thing that you're looking at. And I think that happens a lot. I mean, I practice in finance. Like, I think that happens a lot in finance in particular. And so part of getting at students to take a wider frame as to what the social effects of the work that they're doing ends up bringing on is to teach them about the long history of legal and other governance constructions of those social events in the first place. And so that's not one sentence, but good luck.
Yeah, it's really very difficult to put it in one sentence, especially if it should appear in the report. Spontaneously, I would prefer to say, how can the IPCC reports become more powerful in a wider societal context and be somehow democratized or popularized? Well, that's a question, not a sentence.
Maybe questions are also worthwhile including. Anna.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. I already hinted towards this point. If we really want to grasp the whole challenge of construction, we really need to look at the whole life cycle of a building. And that means including where the materials come from that are now currently partly accounted for in the industrial sector. And that in that sector is taking place outside of the city. You know, it's not accounted for, as you know, in the cities. And that's not just, you know, a game with numbers, but it's really sort of, it doesn't shed the full light on the problem we have, you know, about this bulk of emissions. And that means, as I said, that we also need to look beyond the cities in the landscape and look at, and I come to the trade-offs again, also look at the trade-offs in the landscape because they're related to the dynamics of the cities. Where is the material coming from? Do we have trade-offs with the food sector? Do we have trade-offs with the forest sector? Definitely. So all these issues, they're actually triggered by the urbanization and the building up of our surfaces in the urban areas. So maybe to rethink about this whole also scientific field about the urban metabolism, where there have been lots of studies analyzing the material flows across from landscape to the urban areas. I think that's a highly interesting area that we can reconsider.
Okay, so I think I would be happy to have a recommendation for experimental legislation included. So like really to, trying more experiments also as legislator and like drafting legislation also with sunset clauses and especially with evaluation duties to do that. And I think this would be helpful to give a hint to that to the legislators.
So now we gave you for the last minute quite a list, but I hope this has been a fruitful exchange and also an example for how interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary outreach can work. And now I'm curious what international law has to tell us, and I'm handing over immediately to Helmut Aust and also to Christoph Bernhardt, who will put it into historical perspective. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Is this on? Is this on? Okay, thank you so much. Well, actually, first of all, I want to say thank you to everyone who was on the panel for this very rich conversation, which at least in me triggered a lot of questions. And for this reason, I would actually be prepared to do away with the order of choreography that we had, because I'm still curious whether we would indeed have also questions or comments from the audience. So if anyone has thought about something to bring in at this moment, I would actually like this quite a lot. And I see that there is a question there, so maybe we can bring this in.
Katharina Kaspari, I'm a research assistant at the University of Greifswald, and in that capacity I'm also a research analyst with the German Advisory Council on Global Change, which was already mentioned. Professor Garshagen mentioned that we do not assess vulnerability, social vulnerability enough, and also Professor Gupta said that spoke of the structural capitalism and the problems that come with that in climate adaptation. And I wondered how could law react to this, and I thought to myself that maybe we still remain too much in silo thinking, and at sometimes we don't even come to the point where we have to think of how to navigate trade-offs, also legally. And in international law, of course, we have a lot of climate change cases brought to human rights courts, and also the International Court of Justice dealt with human rights and biodiversity law. But thinking of a federal level, we still remain in tackling problems with Bauordnung and Raumplanungsrecht. So I wondered if law could react more or could promote synergies more. And I'm thinking, for example, of this may be a question to Angela Schwertfeger, maybe to discuss later, of the Bürger- und Gemeindenbeteiligungsgesetze, which try to also to include social issues with the money gained from renewable energies. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. Even if we do not go back to the panel, maybe we can collect some thoughts like this for the discussion over drinks later. And I see there's another comment actually there. Thank you. Nathanael van der Beek.
Yes, thank you very much. I was wondering if there is an option in German admin law, or if that maybe can be transferred somehow to the international level, that we do not maybe regulate certain climate adaptation measures, but we make, I don't know, the permission for building more expensive if there are no climate adaptation measures. I have an example in mind from my hometown Koblenz. There they introduced a rule that residence parking is more expensive for bigger and more or heavier cars because they take more space, the production is more energy intensive. I'm not even sure if they have an electricity advantage, but if you want to drive a bigger car, a heavier car that takes more space, it's more expensive. If you have a smaller car, it's less expensive. And I think this rule was allowed, and I was wondering if cities maybe have such powers to maybe transfer this to the building sector. Thank you very much again for the discussion.
Thank you. I think this also connects back to the plea for experimentalist legislation, maybe, which should be recommended by the IPCC special report. Any other spontaneous interventions? If not, then I think we seek into our concluding observations, and maybe I start right at this point. For my concluding observations, maybe three issues. First, what can cities really do? What should they do, and what must they do? And I think with these questions also, we've been right in the heart of this discussion. We have heard various avenues through which also climate justice could be promoted at the local level, through which climate change could be addressed in a better way. We heard about the primordial role of construction from Anne Holsten, which is a field where also local governments would enjoy maybe, or could enjoy, or could have more powers. We heard about the need to address structural factors in the remarks by Priya Gupta, which I think also intersects in an intriguing way with the repeating references also to indigenous knowledge, indigenous law, indigenous practices, which is something which is featured quite heavy in the upcoming IPCC report, as far as I can see it. All these issues may indeed point to the need to overcome siloed ways of thinking. And I think this was also something which already came up in the keynote by Matthias Garschagen when you talked about the legal framework. It was very obvious that adaptation, the main issue that you dealt with, is not just an issue which can be dealt with through climate change law as a narrowly constructed field, but it has a lot to do with social cohesion, with social security, and all kinds of other legal fields which need to be brought into that. So maybe this is a call for mainstreaming climate change adaptation into other fields of the law, and this will also speak to this aspect of siloed thinking. Now, second point, this goes back to something that Christoph mentioned at the beginning on the panel when you spoke about the new historical situation that we are in. And you connected that to the need for transformative science, to Dipesh Chakrabarty's work. I think this really struck a chord with the panelists, but I think there was also an intriguing and interesting tension with the remarks by Matthias Garschagen on the ever more politicized nature of the discourse surrounding climate change. And you hinted at that the process through which you involve states has also become more challenging at times. And just to myself, I was thinking what you would say, but I'm not putting that as a question to you, but I was just thinking hypothetically, how would you assess the trade-off between having an important and influential state participating in these processes, but thereby maybe also creating situations of blockade, and an important state pulling out and thereby not being able to stand in the way of identifying the scientific consensus. And I think this is one key question for the assessment of this new historical situation in which we're in which cities also play quite an important role. When we look at what happened in the United States when the Trump administration, the first Trump administration withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement, there was quite a heavy wave of local resistance, local opposition, which was done also with a lot of related public relations activities. There was this website, We Are Still In. There was really a broad coalition of cities, other subnational actors, the private sector. And in the current historical situation that we find ourselves in, I have the impression that the reaction from the local level in this state, in the United States, is much more muted this time, which may also have something to do with the changing political economy and the role that the tech sector and the private sector in the United States plays more broadly. But coming back to the kind of challenges that the IPCC faces in this regard, I also kept asking myself during the discussion how challenging it must be to assess the current state of scientific evidence, which is difficult enough when you talk about the natural sciences, but especially with this report on cities, you also look into many questions of governance. And there, I think it's quite challenging to identify with the same scientific precision, so to speak, where there is high confidence or varying degrees of confidence what the best approaches are. And given that you've talked about this explosion of the number of scientific publications, I was also asking myself, what do the different localities of the production of academic literature on these topics in the field of governance mean for the work of the IPCC? Can we preserve democracy and participation as key factors in this regard if there is more work coming also from non-democratic states? And how does this impact on the identification of the scientific consensus with respect to these governance questions? Third point from me before I hand over to Christoph, the time factor, I believe, is something which also came up repeatedly here on the panel, starting with the keynote. I think that was a very strong wake-up call when you talked about coastal cities and adaptation and the time horizons that we have when we think about the duration of planning and building processes in Germany. I think 20 years is basically tomorrow or maybe even yesterday. So I think this is really a challenge, an issue, and this again brings us back to the question of which governance systems are best equipped to deal with these challenges. And this can easily lead to asking uncomfortable questions if we want to focus on and retain and protect democracy and participation, and time is running out, and maybe other forms of governance, other political systems seem to produce better results. I think that shouldn't be taken for granted, but sometimes there could be a temptation to assume that, and that underlines that it's all the more important that also democracies act swiftly. I hand over to Christoph.
Thank you. So after Helmut has perfectly drawn the synthesis, I can limit myself to 3 small observations. Unfortunately, my third point perfectly overlaps with his last point, question of time. I was really impressed and shocked, as we all were, by your small remark, Matthias, about the sea level events, the extreme sea level events, and the formulation, we are running out of time. So the window is closing, and we all know, but there's a lot of reflection that would have to be done. There's research on time layers in the historical sciences. There's a whole new Max Planck Institute on geoanthropology, where they do a lot of research about time logics and new deep time, short time constellations, etc. It's really a new issue. A second very selected observation was we were talking about NGOs, about vulnerable parts of the population. We were not so much talking about economic actors, and we should have them in mind. And this is, as all of you know better than me, also relevant in legal terms in the carbon mayors debate. And the cases in the courts that are interacted there. So this role of economic actors would be worth to keep in mind and to highlight a bit more. And yes, this is my final point. Unfortunately, we did not come back to your idea of the city network research. So there's a lot of experience about the productivity of city networks also in history. They're really laboratories of innovation. We know this in sanitary, in infrastructures of all kinds and social policy. So if this instrument could be even more vitalized and pushed ahead, there could be done a lot more. Thank you. So it's my pleasure now finally to thank the persons who have contributed to this event. First of all, thank you, Helmut, for the wonderful collaboration. Thank you, Matthias Garschagen, for your keynote, and Alexandra Kämmerer and Chiara Rimkus. And Alexandra has guided us through the event. Chiara Rimkus and your team have, from the Max Planck Institute, have organized and supervised all this. And not to forget our panelists, Angela Schwertfeger, Anna Holsten, and Priya Gupta. Thank you so much. And yes, I think it was inspiring. I think we will think about a kind of continuation, perhaps. We will see. But for now, we can move over to the reception and continue our conversation there. Thank you very much for coming.
The investment would then some other area.